My name is Dennis McNanny. For those of you who don't know, I'm the Executive Director for the Oregon Bioscience Association. I want to thank everyone for coming. It's an exciting time for me because I've been looking forward to the publication and the release of the 2014 State New Economy Index. It's important to me because we use it in our documents and our strategic discussions. However, it's not possible without the support of our sponsors, and sponsoring today's event is the Oregon Business Council, the Oregon Business Association, and of course Oregon Bio and the Portland Business Alliance. We're going to go through some introductions, but of course, and then we'll welcome to the stage our guest speaker. We'll start in the room, so those people listening online may not be able to pick up your voices, but if you could say your name and the organization you're with, we'll work through this side of the room, going left to right, and then skip over. So starting with our speaker.
Rob Atkinson, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
Tobias Region, State Representative Pete.
Jessica Eden, Representative Megan Peterson, Stacey Moretz, Academic Health. Michelle Gaddis, Oregon Health and Science University.
Tim Lake, Reed Armitage from the Center of Life Science.
Jonathan Eames from Eames Consulting.
Diane Kudowski Smith, I'm on the board of the Bioscience Association. Kate March, with Oregon State.
Jim Gardner, representing Farm.
Ron Sherman, Silicon Valley Bank.
Marie Tyball, Arizona, startup company.
Bruce Anderson with Northwest Medical. Jake Okenberg with Senator Jeff Murphy's office.
Rachel Jagoda Burnett with the Levelson Foundation. Sarah Simpson, Greater Portland. Madeline Nardone, Representative Williamson's office.
DJ Vogt, Oregon Business Association.
Kelly Yancey with CH2M Hill. Zoe Georgiousis with CH2M Hill.
Doug Kawahara with Polygos Associates.
Michael Cope with University of Phoenix, Oregon campus. Shane Morsetti, University of Phoenix, Oregon campus.
Todd Myers representing Pharma.
Ellie Boggs with Senator Devlin's office.
Senator Richard Devlin.
Matt Smith's Chair of Oregon Bio.
And also, she's too bashful to introduce her, Diane Danowski-Smith. Well, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Probably what most people are waiting for is the presentation of this new study. But I think we should go over a little bit the background of our guest speaker, Rob Atkinson. I'm going to use my glasses because it's the only way I think I can properly do justice to the bio. Dr. Robert D. Atkinson is one of the country's foremost thinkers on innovation economics with an extensive background in technology policy. He has conducted groundbreaking research projects on technology and innovation, is a valued advisor to state and national policy makers, and a popular speaker on the innovation policy both nationally and internationally. He's the author of Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage, and The Past and Future of America's Economy, Long Waves of Innovation that Power Cycles of Growth. Before coming to ITIF, Atkinson was the Vice President of the Progressive Policy Institute and Director of PPI's Technology and New Economy Project. Ars Technica listed Atkins as one of 2009's Tech Policy People to Watch. He has testified before a number of committees in Congress and has appeared in various media outlets, including CNN, Fox News, NSNBC, NPR, and the NBC Nightly News. He received his PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1989. Please welcome Rob Atkinson.
Okay, well, thanks, Dennis. You know, you left out the most important part of my bio, which is that I received my master's degree in 1985 from U of O, where I...
You'll notice only half the room clapped, which is why I avoided the topic altogether.
Are you Oregon State fan?
No, I'm not affiliated.
Okay, non-affiliated, all right. So I keep telling my wife that whenever if we can ever get out of D.C., I want to come back and live in Oregon, which to me was the greatest place I've ever lived. But hard to do global innovation policy from Oregon, so I have to be in Washington. And I should also just quickly say, but we're a think tank in Washington focused on technology policy. We're exclusively nonpartisan or bipartisan, but I just would point out we've had a really great relationship with the Senate delegation here, with Senator Wyden and Senator Merkel. We've enjoyed working with both of their offices on some of these issues as they relate to that in Washington. So, so let me just jump in and sort of get right into what the findings are. So we've been doing this study essentially since 1999. And the idea behind the study is essentially to say, look, there's new success factors for states. I remember in 1989 when I was getting my doctorate, I was asked by the Southern Governors Association to do a big study on the South and economic development in the South and what was going to happen, and I presented that in Wilmington, which for some bizarre reason is part of the South. I didn't know this, but part of the Southern Governors Association. And I presented the study to them, and my basic story in 1989 was, look, the South, you guys are all focused on the wrong thing, because for 50 years you have been trying to succeed simply by cutting costs. Your goal has been to be the low-cost region in the world, and in the United States, to attract industry based on low labor costs, low taxes, low provision of government services. That worked really, really well. But it's not going to work in the future, and that's really what's happened now. Commodity-based production, low-cost production really isn't here anymore unless it's things that can't move, making cement, for example. So the competitive advantage, not just of the old sort of places like Silicon Valley and Boston and New York City, the competitive advantage of the entire country now has to be built around innovation, knowledge-based industries, entrepreneurial dynamism, and global linkages. And that's really what this study tries to assess. It just says, how are state economies structured in this way? It doesn't do policy, it advises on policy, but it doesn't assess states on their policies. So when we look at the overall scores, Oregon appears to be really, really great at consistency. So 14, 14, 15. I would not attribute anything to that decline in one, because we change variables a tad each year as we get hopefully better data. So Oregon's basically in that camp. The way you look at this map is the scores are into 4 quartiles based upon absolute scores, so we don't just take 12 states, 13, we take quartile scores. And not surprisingly, it's hard to see that, but Massachusetts is #1. They've been #1 every year we've done the index. Mississippi is number 50. They've been number 50 every year except one year when they were 49. But you can see the pattern. The pattern is essentially strong sort of performance up in the Northeast, and then strong performance out on the West Coast, and then a few states in the middle: Colorado, Utah, Minnesota. So I'll go through this in terms of what these scores actually represent. So we use, as I said, a wide variety of indicators to try to get at both knowledge jobs and other things. These are IT jobs. By the way, they're IT jobs not in the software industry, so we exclude jobs in the IT industry itself. We just look at, are there IT jobs in the economy, in healthcare, in logistics, in insurance, and you can see Oregon's ranked not actually all that well. They're kind of in the middle of the pack on that indicator. Even the fact that we took out Microsoft, if you will, we took out software, Washington State still ranks #1. Managerial and professional technical jobs. These are jobs that are essentially the high-wage, high-paid, high-skill jobs of the economy. And they're the jobs that tend to be the most important for a state economy and also tend to be the most stable. Oregon, again, not too bad, ranks 15th, but significant improvement, was 26 just 4 years ago. Workforce education. This is simply a measure of how many years of schooling, which is weighted. If you get a PhD, you get more of a weight than if you get a high school degree. And interesting there, a state like Colorado does very, very well, in part because of immigration. People with a lot of education move to Colorado. The sort of black hole of educational attraction is Washington, D.C. Most educated metro in the world, in the country. Lots and lots of lawyers move there to become lobbyists, and it's the core industry of the industry, of course. But the point is, there's a study by Paul Gottlieb at Rutgers recently that showed that the correlation between the educational levels of the workforce and per capita income growth was very, very, very high. So it's sort of like the one thing, if you can do it, is to have a high-skilled workforce, highly educated workforce. This is related to that. This is immigration of knowledge workers. These are, in other words, immigration coming from outside the country. What are the levels of education? Oregon ranks 9th. You can see the states that rank low are largely in the south. That's principally because Latin American immigration, they tend to have lower levels of education than, say, Asian immigration, and there's more Latin American immigration in the south than there is in the north. By the way, I would add on this, if you look at these two, immigration and migration, so migration is coming from other states. You can see Oregon actually is in the very, very fast mover. I don't know, we can't explain that, it just that's what the data show. Oregon went from 30th on immigration of knowledge workers down up to 9th. And then here on migration, so in other words, moving from one state to the next, Oregon went from 29th to 11th. So this is a pretty important indicator in the sense that the people who are moving into Oregon from other states, do they have a high school degree, do they have a college degree, and this suggests Oregon's doing pretty well here. Manufacturing value added, this is essentially a measure of saying, is your manufacturing sector, which includes a lot of, by the way, life sciences, is it competing on value, is it competing on innovation, is it competing on quality, or does it tend to compete on cost and commodity factors? Oregon does very, very well there, ranks 3rd. And that even where we essentially try to take out and control for the fact that you have Intel, in terms of control for semiconductors and life sciences, and try to control for all that, Oregon still does quite well. High-wage traded services. These are essentially service industries. So for example, in the life sciences side of this would be laboratory services would be included in here. These are services that pay a lot, the service sector that pay a lot, but are traded across borders. So it wouldn't include things like local gardening services or things like that. It would be high-wage services that could be traded across borders. Oregon's ranks 20th. Okay, I'm going to just sort of skip through some of these export focus. These next two, I think, are an area where Oregon could do better. It's really around globalization. Foreign direct investment, Oregon actually ranks quite low, 42nd on that. Now, in part, you can see the picture here. The picture is there's the most high levels of FDI over here. That's because even still with Asia, about 65% of US FDI is coming from Europe still. And they just like to go to the East Coast because you save 3 hours on 4 hours or 5 hours on the plane ride. But I think with the rise of Asia, particularly with the rise of what's the Chinese government now called the going out strategy, where Chinese enterprises are being incented to go out and become multinationals, that would suggest that the West Coast could have some new opportunities in this space. Job churning, this is an indicator just saying how many jobs are being created and how many jobs are dying. Now you can say, why would you care about dying? It turns out actually there's a positive correlation between the share of jobs that go out of business, that die, that go away in a state, and overall job growth. The more jobs that are dying, the more companies that are going out of business, the faster the job growth is. Very, very strange. But the theory would be, sort of in an evolutionary perspective, you want an economy that's turbulent. You want an economy that's changing. You don't want an economy that's doing the same thing all the time because you can't keep up. Fast-growing firms, these are essentially the 500,000 fastest-growing firms in the country over the last 3 or 4 years. Oregon kind of flips around, but essentially 22nd. IPOs, again, companies that have gotten to the point where they need to go to the public markets. Oregon 35th. Entrepreneurial activity, people starting new companies. Again, it suggests that one of the challenges with this data, one is around globalization for Oregon, and another is around innovation, entrepreneurship, invention, being able to build a better ecosystem there. Inventor patents, it's actually an area where Oregon has done quite well and still does pretty well. Second at one point, now 11th in the country. These are patents that are filed by individuals, which has some measure of innovation and success. Broadband, Oregon ranks 13th. This is actually a pretty easy story here. These are all the top, essentially 8 states. It's largely because Verizon has deployed fiber to the home more extensively than anybody else, so those states do quite well. Okay, health IT. This is essentially how much IT is being used in the healthcare sector, how digital it is. Oregon's 14th. Okay, just a couple more, and then Oregon in terms of high-tech jobs. These would be jobs in the life sciences industry, in the semiconductor industry, in basically any industry that's defined as being a high R&D intensive industry. Oregon ranks 15th, which is not bad. Scientists and engineers, interesting. Oregon ranks 15th on high-tech jobs, but 25th on scientists and engineers, which suggests that there may be some opportunities there to improve. Patents, Oregon's 25th. Industry investment in R&D, Oregon ranks 9th. Again, that may be because of companies here like Intel or other biotech firms or the like. Okay, and then this is an interesting one because this is non-industry investment R&D, which is sort of from foundations, from hospitals, from states, from federal government. And if you know sort of federal lab locations, it's pretty clear. This is Los Alamos. The New Mexico delegation really does a great job for their state, we should just put it that way. Yeah, get a lot of money. And then all the, this is NIH and NIST and NSA and all of those up in Maryland. And lastly, movement to a green economy. This is sort of the growth of energy efficiency as well as the use of renewable energy. And there's actually a state place where Oregon ranks the best in the country on this, which would, you might imagine that as the president moves forward with the proposal on utility regulation on coal, that could put Oregon in a better position relative to other states. And lastly, venture capital. Again, sort of similar to the federal lab map. There is so much venture capital in California and Massachusetts. It's just those are just the hubs that it really distorts that. But still, there is venture capital in many, many states, and Oregon is at ranks 16. So let me just wrap up quickly. Sort of, what does all that mean? These are sort of high-level principles I think most places get, but oftentimes they don't even get that. One is just, I think a lot of states, and I understand it now with the recession and joblessness, but as the economy comes back, as the labor market gets stronger, states really need to be shifting, I think, more towards high-wage, high-value jobs. A lot of states still give big incentive packages to basically for jobs that pay, $10 an hour. I don't know what's the point of that. The point of economic development is to create high-wage jobs. And being here with life science is a good example. The wages are 70 to 90% higher than the average wage of other jobs. We should be thinking about how do we support high-wage jobs because they have big multipliers. There's that study, if anybody hasn't seen the book, it's a really, really great book that just came out. I think it's Stanford or Berkeley professor. It's The Entrepreneurial State. We just reviewed it, by the way, if you want to go to our website, ITIF.org, we just did a summer tech launch reading list. So for those of you who really, really can't get enough of this stuff, there's a reading list there, and that book is on there. But one of the points that professor made in the book was that high-tech regions and high-tech jobs, it really does lift all boats. They found that wages for sort of, low-wage service workers, retail, actually did really a lot better in places that had high-wage, high-tech jobs. And it wasn't just this, the people at the top did well, those regions lifted all boats. So I think that's an important part. Again, sort of economic-based firms, you want to really focus on firms that are going to be selling outside the region, because that's fundamentally what you have to do. I mean, for a long time, Oregon sold wood. And that's what made people be able to buy cars in Oregon. If you're given wood, you're getting cars. You don't have the wood, you got to have something else to sell, and that's a key. This thing, I think, this factor number 3. I think if you look at the studies on how many new firms that you can go out and are in play every year, in other words, companies that announce a new location, say, okay, we're going to put a new factory somewhere, or we're going to put a new research and development lab somewhere. Though the amount of those have fallen by half over the last 20 years. There just aren't very many of those things to go recruit. They now go much more to places like Mexico or China. They don't go here as much. So it's a lot harder to get those things, and the competition for those factories and those facilities is about twice as hard as it was 20 years ago. So half as many, twice as much competition. that really means fundamentally that the future of state economies has got to be about building innovation, entrepreneurship, and invention from within. All states have got to be like California, if you will, or Silicon Valley. We hear a lot about the importance of small business. The reality is small business is not important. I'm just going to say that. It's high growth small businesses that are key. It's firms that are going to grow from 1 or 10 to 100 to 1,000. It's not somebody who has a pizza parlor who's going to grow from 4 to 5. They're nice to have, but that's not really where policy should be focused. Again, the competition, I know it's easy to think here. In Oregon, probably you think the competition is from the next city over. Oftentimes people think that way. But the reality is competition is really now much more global. These facilities, these ideas, these products, the business competition is really from all around the world. And then the last part is, if you could sort of wave the magic wand, what would you want? You'd want low cost and high quality. That's what every firm wants. That's the secret. Now, obviously, you can't always get that. You have to have trade-offs. But the worst thing you can have is you could have high cost and low quality. That would be like the worst, right? There are states that have that, and they don't do very, very well. There are states like California, sort of has a lot of high costs, but it's offset with a lot of other factors, which is why companies are willing to put up with it. But I think for a state like Oregon, you got to kind of be in both of those games, and it requires some strategic thinking. So the last thing I'll just say quickly, every year at the index, we try to list some what we think are interesting and hopefully novel policy suggestions or ideas that state and local policymakers might think about adopting. And this year we did something a little different. We decided to look at what's going on around the world, and so we contacted a lot of colleagues in multiple countries on multiple continents and asked them to say, what's the most interesting thing going on in your country, your subnational region on innovation-based economic development. And so there's a bunch of those listed in the back of the report, but let me just list a few that I think are particularly interesting. Innovation vouchers. Just, by the way, listed just a few countries because there are more countries doing it. These are an interesting program where they take these vouchers of about 25,000 to 30,000 euros or dollars, so $30,000, and they give them to entrepreneurs or vendors or small companies and say, you can use this at Portland State University or University of Oregon or whatever, and you can buy yourself some technical services, some R&D. And it's really transformed a lot of those systems. The universities have become much more responsive to the needs of entrepreneurs because there's a market there now for them. The entrepreneurs now say, wow, I can really be more focused on innovation and technology because I have a way to get problems solved that I might not be able to get solved otherwise. Refundable R&D tax credits. This is an idea a number of countries and some provinces in Canada do that, where a startup or a small company that's a long way from profitability, and therefore they can't take the federal or the state R&D credit, even with tax moving tax credits forward. There's a bill in the Senate now called the Startup America 2.0 bill. I believe that's the bill, and it has a refundable R&D tax credit provision in there that's refundable against the UI taxes you would pay. That's a pretty interesting idea, and it's something a lot of other countries already do. Performance-based university funding. This is an interesting notion where rather than just sort of go to the university and say, would you please work with entrepreneurs? Would you please work with industry? What a number of countries are doing is saying, look, we're going to tie the funding you get. In Sweden, it's 5 or 10%. In Finland, it's up to 25%. We're going to tie that to how well you work with industry. And if you're University of Gothenburg, and you're really, really great at working with industry, and you're really, really great, and you're getting your faculty to spin off companies and licensing technologies, you're going to get a little bit more money than, say, University of Lund. And again, sort of trying to build incentives into that system. Design assistance. We don't sort of think about design, but why is Apple one of the most valued brands in the world? They have great technology, but Apple has great design. And so a lot of places are realizing that design is this important component of economic success and competitiveness. So there's a bunch of countries that now have very, very interesting design assistance centers, Ontario, the UK, and others. This is what really, to me, it's always amazing to me why anybody would ever start a firm because it is so complicated. You have to hire lawyers to actually start a firm. And I'm not talking about incorporating a corporation. I'm talking about just a sort of sole proprietor Schedule C firm. So Portugal decided to do this thing, 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Every form, local, state, national, in 45 minutes you've established a firm that's legally represented, and all the things you ever have to do with the government are automatically done electronically. Chile just copied it about a year ago. I don't know of a single state in this country who does this. I could be wrong. I have not heard of a single state in the country who do it. Very easy to do. You could do it tomorrow. And last thing, interesting idea is a number of states, a number of countries. Brandenburg is a lander in Germany. Alberta, obviously, they've created what's called the industrial PhD program. So when I got my PhD, I never told my professors this, but I knew I didn't want to teach. I didn't tell them that because they wouldn't have given me my PhD. Sort of slightly kidding. But I didn't want to teach. I knew that. I wanted to do what I'm doing now. And PhD programs aren't really designed for that, for working in industry. And yet, there are places like this where the government co-funds some of the programs, and these PhD students go out, and as part of their PhD experience, they go out and they work with biotech startups. They go out and they work with robotics firms. And it gives the firms this incredible access to talent, and it helps with the training program. So anyway, so I'm not saying these are all, perfect programs that Oregon should adopt, but I think the point is there is so much competition now around the world. I mean, you can't really believe it unless you see it. Every country that we deal with, that we talk to, I was just down in Uruguay. Uruguay has an innovation czar now, and Uruguay is really thinking about how they can win on innovation. Uruguay is actually a really big IT offshore company in the site now. So the point is, the competition is so intense, and the competition just to do new things. I think we all have to sort of meet that. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to our next speaker. So thank you.
So we'll move the program along. I'll preface the introduction by saying that our next speaker is representing District 19, Senator Richard Devlin. But I'll preface the introduction by saying I got an opportunity to work with Senator Devlin this last year on a piece of legislation that I think dovetails nicely with the innovation discussion taking place today. It is essentially an applied STEM program for mid-career adults who are looking to be retrained in an immersion program for the bioscience industry, helping people who are maybe trapped in home mortgages that they can't get out from underneath, so they can't chase whatever their current career is in another location. They really need to make the transition into the biosciences. And this, I think, will be first in its nation type of program that will really validate an entirely new tier of STEM education. So I'm excited to introduce Senator Richard Devlin. Also working with us on that program was Representative Vega Peterson and Representative Reed, who has a representative, and obviously Representative Reed's here with us today. But Senator Devlin, if you could join us. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I guess good afternoon. Pleased to be here with my colleague, Representative Reed. I feel a little bit better about speaking here today than I did a few years back when the Dean of the School of Forestry asked me to come speak at a conference of foresters about the future of forestry in the state, given my broad background, which is very limited in forestry. I have a little bit more background here, but not as much as many of the people here in the room. When I think about innovation, I actually think about language in a sense, because language is important. What do people mean by innovation? I mean, I had a chance to read the report. Well, it was embargoed in the last 48 hours. And actually, since I was asked to talk about fostering innovation, I thought it was important to understand what people meant by innovation. That sounds like an easy question, but I don't think it is as easy as it sounds. So I read literally a couple hundred different definitions of innovation. And from your standpoint, I think the one that actually came the closest was it's something new or something improved, whether it's a product or whether it's a process, or whether it's an idea. But it's not just that. It actually has to add economic value. It's just not something new or something improved. There actually has to be an economic benefit to it. And when I think about what the state actually does, and we are a very relatively large geographic state, relatively modest level of population for the size of state we are, and unfortunately a relatively modest economy for the state that we have, I try to think about some of the things we've done, some of the things we've done right, some of the things we've done less than right, and some of the things that we've maybe done wrong. And what I came up with is I was just doing a list of things that we've worked on over the years. Some of them Representative Reed's been very involved in, signature research centers, sort of trying to create a public-private partnership and bring our university research capabilities together with the private sector. Some of the things we've done to try to get Oregonians who are interested in entrepreneurial activities more access to world markets. The investments we've made in engineering in terms of ITIF and as ITIF evolves. The tax policies that we've tried to create, this is one of them that's sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes in the middle. One that would be a little controversial perhaps because it doesn't look like it's an entrepreneurial activity. The $200 million we have just invested in OHSU, which I think some of us hope will spring benefits over the next several decades that will make this more of a center for bio research and more of a center for medical research. Some of the things like the creation of the organ growth account, so we can try to invest a little bit more money here at home that actually benefits Oregonians in long terms. Facilities like this that we've helped fund for the university system. The speaker was talking about PhD programs. I've been in a way involved, although I think they're not doing as well now, in what are called professional master's degrees. So you bring somebody with a fair amount of scientific capabilities, but you try to give them some business capabilities also, so they understand that everything isn't just theoretical, that you've actually got to deliver a product to market somehow. Now, I've been known when I talk to people to depress people, so I'm not going to disappoint. When I look at these issues, the thing that I look at is we're a relatively modest economy. We're making investments that are at relatively modest levels. Our capabilities to make investments are somewhat limited because of our modest capabilities. It's sort of like when I purchased my last car, they checked my credit score and I was at a Toyota dealership and there happened to still be, identify the location, a Lamborghini dealership across I-5. And they said, well, you could buy a Lamborghini. I told them I couldn't afford a Lamborghini. So, I mean, that's similar in a state. We're similar in a state that can't afford to basically make hundreds of millions of dollars investments. We have to be very strategic in our investments. But when I look at this report, and I've read previous editions of it, and I'm going to spend a lot more time on this version of it, because I'm going to look at it in advance, well in advance of the 2015 session. I see gaps. I mean, what I'm seeing is that, I mean, to be honest, I'm happy that in something we're ranked 14th or now 15th, because most things we're ranked 42nd, 44th, 48th out of 50 states. So I'm pretty happy to be ranked 15th. But when I looked at the report in a little bit more detail, and you've got these 5 broad categories, and you've got 25 subcategories, in those 25 subcategories, we're only listed in the top 5 states in two. Manufacturing, value-added, and online agriculture. I think both are very important, and both basically demonstrate some things the state has done well, but you're only listed in 2. And then I think even a more important factor is where you're listed in terms of your improvement. So out of those 25, you're only listed in 2. Which are managerial, professional, and technical jobs, obviously very important, and immigration of knowledge workers, obviously very important. But in a sense, most people like to think of things in terms of new and improved and interesting and sexy and all that. I like to think of things in terms of what steps do you have to take to actually do something? What is the incremental things that you can do that if we were to look at this report and if we believed that these indicators are actually predictive of our future of being successful in a new economy, there's some of them we obviously would have a very hard time. We're not going to have an MIT here anytime soon. But there are others of them where with a real strategy over a period of time, we could improve our status in some of those areas. And if we were to pick 2 or 3 that we thought over the next 3 or 4 years that we could actually improve, dedicate what limited resources we have to those, and find some ways, I mean, it wouldn't be a bad thing. I think the speaker said we get credit for being stable. 14th, 15th, I guess on one of the early reports we were 17th. But it would really be nice to be 11th or 10th or 9th. And so I think that's what I'd like to leave you with. I think Representative Reed and I are both very interested in assisting in any way we can, and I think many of our colleagues in the legislature, as the governor is, assist, and understanding the limitations of our limited resources. But I do think if you make wise investments, you can have considerably good returns, and I think that's one of the things we need to do.
Thank you, Senator. So I am the next speaker. So Dennis McNaney, the Executive Director for the Oregon Bioscience Association. I think one of the things that struck me, and I take to the comments of Senator Devlin, I mean, it's realism is really, I think, the only way you can make real progress. And one of the incremental steps we took was, as I discussed earlier, ASTEM and getting that piece of legislation passed. And that's really indicative of an area where I think we are showing great strength and great momentum. If I were to look at the indexes that were covered, 2 of the ones that were mentioned involved the migration of smart people to Oregon. And if you were to sum up, I think, the biggest ingredient of an innovative economy, it centers around smart people. Your ability to attract them, retain them, leverage their skills. Money will follow eventually. Other resources, other infrastructure will be built. But if you lack the momentum of being able to attract smart people, you said yourself you'd like to move back to Oregon. You're not alone in that. And I think it's contingent on Oregon to provide an ecosystem that's able to absorb those people. We zeroed in on a lot of the statistics, so I won't go over some of the ones that I noted. But I think the other thing I took away from reading the document was how dependent an innovative economy is on the various stakeholders within that particular ecosystem. We are competing worldwide for these jobs, and one of the things that used to be controversial, but as I read these reports it becomes more and more fact, is that it requires a public-private partnership. A lot of the infrastructure that drives these innovative economies cannot be done totally from the private sector. So it's super important that we are able to pull together public-private partnerships in order to accelerate our growth in given areas. I would say this, sort of as a final point. It's good to focus where we're at, and I've been tracking this document and its various iterations for the last 3 versions. But it's more important to look prospectively and into the future where you want to be. So I agree with Senator Devlin. I would like to see us move from our current position up into the top 10. But it's going to require a cohesiveness among the stakeholders, both policymakers, industry, academic institutions, philanthropists, economic development agencies. So one of the things that we'll be doing in the next couple of weeks is releasing a 5-year roadmap for bioscience. And this speaks more towards where we want to be in the future and what it incrementally takes amongst the stakeholders, tactically, the things they need to do to get us there. So this is the first time this document has been produced. You are generously quoted and your reports are generously referenced in the document. So I've been looking forward to getting this latest edition and charting, with the help of all the stakeholders, a 5-year vision for where bioscience should be. So with that, let's move on to the next item on the agenda. Which is the panel discussion with all of us. Are we repositioning or just standing here together for the panel discussion?
Set the three, move your chairs over to the center.
Senator Devlin joins us. Awesome. All right, now's your chance to ask questions, get feedback from the panel. As we ask questions, if you could identify yourself and.
John Denise, for Dr. Atkinson. So if you were to look at Massachusetts, who's been one this year and all previous years, how much do you think their success or their ranking is due to state investment as opposed to, you know, location of universities or concentration of universities, or their geographic location? How much do you think it has been from the state actually investing in innovation?
I think it's 90 to 95% location, and not geographic location. You know, when you have a place like MIT and you take the sales of the MIT spin-offs over the last 50 years, it's like something like the 12th largest country in the world. You know, you have essentially an innovation machine there, not just at MIT, but you know, talking about biotechnology, I mean the Broad Center, the Tyndall Square, you know, so a lot of that has to do with historical factors. American Research and Development Corporation, the very first venture capital firm in the world, was established in Boston in 1946. You had an enormous amount of defense spending in World War II that went up there because we needed missiles, we needed all of those things, and that kept up through the Cold War. So you had this confluence of, you know, really good universities, really high-tech defense companies, and a bunch of other things. The state has done some good things, don't get me wrong. I think the state has been able to build off of that and put in place a number of good programs and initiatives over the last, say, 30 or 40 years, including now what's called Mass Tech Collaborative. But they're lucky, you know. As the Senator Devlin said, you don't have an MIT. But I think one key thing about that, though, there's a new report that I helped work on, or I was an advisor on, which I encourage you to look at if you haven't seen it. It's a report called High Tech U, so high tech and then the letter U, 2.0, and it's a report by a colleague of mine, Lou Tarnotsky, and it's the second version, the first one about a decade ago. And what we did in the report, or what he did, is took, I think, 20 universities in the country who do really, really well on tech commercialization, spin-offs, licensing, patenting. And they're not all MITs. Utah is a good example of that. So you don't have to have Caltech and MIT. That helps. But there are places that punch above their weight, largely because of the leadership involved and because of the policy involved. So I think there are things, again, I thought, Senator, your point about having a realistic goal of going up 4 or 5 spots over 4 or 5 years, I think that's right. You're not going to be number one, at least for foreseeable future. But if you were to be number 8, that's a very important improvement, for example.
Other question?
Matt Smith's chair of Oregon Bio. One of the things that I kind of picked up on in the report is that within the Oregon scores, actually our inventor patent volume is actually very attractive, like 0.11. Whereas if you then compare that against the entrepreneurial activity, it's like 36. So it struck me that I interpreted that as we have a hard time translating innovations into business formations as a whole. Is that an interpretation you would see, or what is your take on that?
So the problem with all these data is twofold. One is you're sort of grabbing measures that exist to give you some hopeful sense that it relates to what you're really trying to measure. So what you're really trying to measure there is, are individuals and enterprises constantly developing new products, new processes, new business models, and putting them in the marketplace. And so those are two that you could do. The Europeans, by the way, they just go out and they ask their firms, and you can get that data really, really great. We don't do that in this country. I think of those two measures, the inventor patent is a more important measure, because some of those individuals who start the companies, they're just individuals who just say, I've always wanted to open up a little craft store or something like that, and that's a new business startup, and it's legitimate and all. Whereas inventors, if you patent something, you have the potential to grow a company. So I think the really interesting thing would be, and I don't know how hard it would be for the state to do this, would be to identify every single inventor in Oregon who filed a patent or received a patent, and ask him or her, how's it going? What are you doing? Are you able to commercialize this, or is it a hobby patent, or are you just planning to sell it to somebody else, or are you trying to build a company? Oh, and if you're trying to build a company, how can we help? Do you need space? Do you need? Are you looking for financing? You need partnerships. I mean, that's the other thing I think that's interesting. Some of the new accelerators around the country, like the one in DC, 1776, it's an interesting model because it's really built around partnerships with bigger OEMs and bigger companies, and built, getting into their supply chain and their marketing systems. So that might be an interesting thing, because it is a strength that Oregon appears to have. You have people who are inventing things, but are they taking the next step? And I don't know. That would be a good question to ask.
In the back?
You make a distinction, which I think is important, between just regular manufacturing output and manufacturer value added. Oregon appears to do well, regardless if you look at just manufacturing as a portion of GSP without stripping out value add or not. But then also it's still third under the data that you look at. I noticed that on the handout there's some other things that organizations put out, including one refuting the idea of a manufacturing renaissance. Given that you do focus on the value add portion of it, what are you seeing nationwide in terms of value add manufacturing? Are we stagnant as a nation? Are we falling behind? Are we growing? And where does Oregon fit into that?
So this is a really, I think, central question to the U.S. prosperity. And the problem with answering it is that the data sets that the government has are at around 2.5 years old. So all of this stuff about manufacturing renaissance is based upon opinion, as is mine. No renaissance based upon opinion. But if you just look at the sort of from 2000 to the end of 2010, and I'm happy to go into more detail later, there's measurement issues, all sorts of things. Our assessment was that U.S. inflation-adjusted manufacturing value added went down 11%. Never happened in our history before. We've never had a decade in American history from 1776 to the present where we lost manufacturing value added. That's why we lost 1/3 of our manufacturing jobs. There's only one other country in the world that lost more manufacturing jobs than we did in the 2000s. And so I think what's happened in U.S. manufacturing is we were losing, for about every maybe one that was coming back, we were losing 10. And I think there's some rough guesstimates now that we're sort of for every one we're losing, we're getting sort of 0.8 back. So it's a lot better than it was a decade, in the worst of the 2000s, partly because of natural gas and cheap natural gas, increases in the prices in China, some issues with the dollar relative to the euro. But I don't think we can just take it for granted that it's going to happen. One thing other countries do, they actually have policies. Okay, so I know that's strange, but our manufacturers pay the highest effective corporate tax rate of 15 major competitors that we face. We just have a new blog, it'll be up today. There are countries like Korea, Japan, UK, Germany that are putting in some order of 10, 20, 30, 60 times more money in cooperative research and development efforts for their commercial companies to be competitive. 60 times more than we do. And those companies are able to use that to be competitive. So skills is another good example. Most other countries have really good apprenticeship programs and skill certification programs for manufacturing workers. We have a hodgepodge. There's no national policy. There's no national support for that. One proposal that we really are big supporters of is that the administration has a proposal called the NNMI. There's a bipartisan bill in the Senate called RAMI, Renew America's Manufacturing Initiative or something. Very good bill. and it's to create these public-private centers. So, for example, Chicago won one on digital manufacturing, Ohio won one on what's called additive manufacturing. There's no reason there's no reason Oregon couldn't do one, maybe a joint one with Washington on life sciences. So I think those are the kinds of policies we're going to need. I'm very confident that the U.S. could do quite well going forward in the future. But I just think we have to have policies at the national and the state level that move in that direction. So, real lesson, I think it's going to be hard for Oregon to do well unless the country is doing well. If the country does well, I think Oregon's reasonably well positioned compared to some other states. But if the country's not in this space, it's going to be harder.
So that third place that the rankings have for us in value add, is that Intel, semiconductor manufacturing?
You know, it shouldn't be.
Or is that pulled out?
The methodology we use, I won't go into the details, I'm happy to do it after. The methodology we use tries to control for industry mix, so it should pull that out. I'm not saying that it does effectively because of the way the data sets are, but it tries to do that. It tries to just say, regardless of your industry, how as a firm are you relative, and that's what we're trying to get. So it does suggest it's not just Intel in Oregon, that the firms in Oregon are competing on high value rather than just trying to keep labor costs down and just make commodity things to compete with China.
Hi, I'm interested in your thoughts on the balance between regulatory policies and innovation. And I work mostly in health IT. A lot of the leading health electronic health record systems firms are complaining about the push towards interoperability, the regulatory framework for that, and yet it's so the success of the Affordable Care Act in terms of lowering costs and measuring improvement in care is so dependent on the interoperability and communication pathways. So how do you balance that as regulators? I work a lot with the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, and I think they're really struggling in that role. So I'm just curious about your thoughts.
So that's a big question, I guess. I think one of the lessons that we learned from other countries, especially when we wrote our book, Innovation Economics, is that other countries approach this in a very pragmatic way. In the U.S. we tend to be, conservatives don't like regulation and Democrats like public investment. Other countries are like, we want to streamline and have regulation that works and not be overly burdensome. Oh, and by the way, we also want public investment in these areas. So I think we have a harder time sort of saying that we have to get both right. I've talked to a number of venture funders in the medical device industry, and to some extent in bio, who tell me, at least, that the European regulatory system is much easier for them. I mean, Europe, you wouldn't think Europe's an easier place, but one of the things the Europeans have done is they realize they have to have a much easier to deal with regulatory system if they're going to gain competitive advantage globally. Our regulators that's not a factor that's in their mind. They're not scored on that, they're not ranked on that. They're ranked only on have you protected patients and others. They're not ranked on speed. Are you doing concurrent processes or parallel parallel processing? When it comes to health IT, we are woefully behind other countries. So we issued a report about 3 or 4 years ago where we ranked countries on who's doing the best in health IT. And it was the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. You go to Denmark, 93 or 94% of doctors have EHRs. In the U.S. now, it's 25 or 30. It's a little
better than that now.
Yeah, a little better than that, but nowhere near what 90% of the Danes have PHRs. Google and Microsoft left that space because there's no PHRs here, or very few. And that was due to smart policy. The problem in the U.S. is we've got states that sort of want to do their own thing, and then you don't get this sort of coordination. We haven't really put the money behind this at the federal level. The coordinator's doing yeoman's work, but there's no money behind it, or very little money behind it. I think it's a problem we will ultimately solve, but the world's moving very fast. The last thing I'll just say, by the way, is I think HIPAA is a problem here, Health Privacy Act. A lot of the benefit of health IT is going to be data and analytics and data innovation. And there are real barriers now to you taking big data sets and you know, learning really important things about health outcomes because we've locked the data down so much. We've got a report coming out Monday on with the Ontario Privacy Commissioner, a joint report on why the myth that you cannot de-identify data. It is a myth. You can de-identify data, and you can do it quite well. And if you de-identify data, you just go for it. Do the analytics and see where it goes. So I think we do have a lot of challenges there that we could do a lot better on.
I would add, having been in the software business, in that sector of the software business, that there was lots of incentives for adoption, but very little in the way of incentives for compliance. So it was very early identified that these systems had to talk to each other so that people could add best of breed vignette solutions to these more monolithic large solutions. But you know, any large monolithic software company, regardless of its sector, begins to act territorial once they gain a market share. And so it's hard for smaller companies to break in with these more specific solutions. And what appears odd to me is it's not like they didn't think of it from the very, very beginning. It just never was a priority as part of the implementation. Anything to mention on software in the state of Oregon?
I could mention one thing, and it's a very specific item, actually, is that I'm not saying that this company has a good product. I actually don't know enough to know if they have a good product. But I've met a couple of times with a company that's located in my district that's produced a product, a software product, trying to actually give employers tools to monitor wellness programs so that they know that although the employee is signing up for the program, whether they're actually doing the things that they actually say that they're doing in the program, which you think would be of interest to employers. But one of the hardest sectors they're dealing with is the public sector, because the public sector likes to give accolades for all they're doing to create wellness programs for employees, but they really don't want an additional burden of actually monitoring whether or not those programs are actually producing results, even though they're having costs. And I'm not saying that this company's, I don't know enough about their product to know if it's a good product or a great product, but it's interesting the barriers that you have, because something that you would think is important sometimes is not, if it's just not on the short list of things that we need to do. And that may be also true in the private sector also. I mean, I'm just referring to some of the discussions they've had with public sector entities.
Additional question?
Sure. First, I want to congratulate you for putting nuclear energy in your definition of clean energy, so those calculations and calculations. I think that's a great thing. It's an honest way. It gives us a better view. But to your checklist that you used in your presentation, you talked about design assistance. Can you say more about that? How's that shaped? What color is that? What are you referring to when you think to include that in the checklist?
So there's more detail in the report, and the person who actually knows the most about this on our team is Stephen Ezell, who's actually advised some of these governments on services innovation, including on design. So he's much deeper in it than I am. But the notion is that if you look at a country like Denmark or Sweden or Germany, and you look at a lot of their products, they're very, very nicely designed. They have a nice design aesthetic, and when you do that, you're able to have a price premium because of that, and it's easier. So the Germans, for example, the German totally fully loaded manufacturing, the labor costs are about 45% more expensive than American manufacturing labor costs. So they're a high cost place of doing business, and yet they run a trade surplus with China. We run a $300 billion trade deficit with China, $400 billion, $250, depending on the year, and yet our labor costs are almost on par with South Korea. And one of the reasons those countries are able to do that is because of design. And so what these programs do is that they do a number of things, but one is they try to build linkages with schools of design and smaller and mid-sized companies. The big guys, the big companies don't need any design help, but the mid-sized and smaller companies do. And the other thing is they integrate some of their, a lot of countries, a lot of regions have sort of programs where they just go out and they do technical assistance for companies. You know, do you need help with exporting? Do you need help with this? And they will incorporate a design component in that. So when they talk to companies, they'll assess them and say, how are you doing on design? Do you think you need help on this new product or whatever to reshape design? So that's kind of it. You might want to look at the Ontario program because it probably is the closest fit to what a state like Oregon could do. I'm happy to give you that information if you'd like.
Question?
Bruce Anderson, Northwest National, very interesting. Curious, just maybe shifting gears a little bit into our revenue systems and so forth that didn't factor into the index that you put together here. But bring in some examples of innovation, incentives, and or financial incentives and so forth, tax credits. That's a little bit of a buzzword here in the state. But I'm just curious about, how does our state revenue system fit into this, and maybe what kind of financial assistance would there be maybe that you would see from a state government?
Yeah, so I hesitate to do that because I'm sure I'm jumping into major political morass here with the chairman of the budget committee. But I think, as a general rule of thumb, as a theory, if you will, there's a think tank in the UK. I'm blanking on their name. We've used your work in the past, and they have this. What they say is, like, what you really want to do in the optimal world is you want to tax traded sectors at zero and non-traded sectors at the rest. In other words, people and things that can move, you don't want to tax them. People and things that can't move, you tax them. Okay. Now you can't obviously do that because of fairness issues, but you can move in that direction. And I think that's a reason why I think every state should have a sales tax. I know that's controversial, but sales tax, most people don't notice it. The people who have to bear it you're not going to move from one state. Very few people are going to move to one state or the next because they have a sales tax or they don't have a sales tax. Corporate income taxes do matter much more, and so if you're getting more of your revenue from corporate income taxes and less from sales taxes at the margin, it's going to have an effect. The other component of that, I think, is incentives like the R&D tax credit. When I chaired the Governor's Policy Council in Rhode Island and back in the 90s when we were in big trouble, one of the things we did is we put in place the highest R&D tax credit in the world, or in the country, I should say, at the state level. Now I cannot prove this next association, so take it for what it is, but the state ended up doing better in corporate R&D 5 years later. I don't know if that was because of that. There have been a number of studies, by the way, including the San Francisco Fed and a number of academics, though, who have studied state R&D tax credits and have shown that they do have an effect, not just on the amount of R&D that, like, Oregon companies would do, but on where companies would do it, like where Intel would put their R&D. A company like Intel or Nike, they can put R&D anywhere in the world, really, as long as there's some scientists there. So tax incentives like that at the margin can help companies shift their activities.
I think part of the issue about tax credits is trying to determine whether a tax credit will actually achieve the result that you're trying to achieve. So, for instance, there's been a lot of controversy over particularly the wind side of our previous Betsy, which you would think that somebody could have thought, giving you an example, that a creative person could take a project that you would have given a $10 million tax credit to normally, broken it up into 3 projects and received 3 $10 million tax credits. That's an example of probably very poor planning. A very small, really not a tax credit, but a bill that Representative Reed and I were chief sponsors on, which is SB 219 from the 2011 session, which the sunset on that bill was just removed, I believe, in the 2013 session, actually is sort of a show-me bill in a sense. It, for certain entities who bring jobs into the state or actually expand their workforce in certain areas in terms of income levels, we will give a loan to. If they actually meet the criteria in that over a period of time, the loan will be forgiven. So it's actually a performance-based subsidy. It's not huge, but it's sort of like an additional it's like an additional tool in the toolbox to try to attract a company that wants to expand here versus going somewhere else, or a company that we'd like to attract here to at least have one more tool that we could offer them. I can tell you it's fairly controversial when it was proposed, but I think it's worked out relatively well, and it's probably kind of a model that you should look at. I'll say something here that's probably going to be controversial and maybe get back and haunt me. There's been a little bit of debate about not your area, film industry tax credit, about whether or not that should be a credit at all, or whether we should just basically offer a subsidy. Because what we basically do now is we offer a credit. That credit is sold on a second market at a discount, and we could actually give the true beneficiary of that credit the full benefits that they're receiving now for less money if we moved it from being a credit that's sold on a secondary market to actually just giving them a direct subsidy. But that's, again, a little bit of a controversial discussion to have, to get anyone, particularly a direct subsidy. I just think that, credits actually, some extent have done some very good things, but I think people need to think about them from the standpoint of, are they actually going to achieve the intended result? So.
I think similar along those lines, when you have R&D tax credits for emerging and innovative companies, we don't have money to start with. I mean, I think they're better off getting a loan that can be forgiven than an R&D tax credit against money they don't have to even invest.
Yeah.
So I think R&D tax credits work well with established corporations who have R&D, but if you're trying to stimulate innovation from a raw startup standpoint, it doesn't do much good if you don't have money to get your advice point first.
Yeah, and I think that's why a number of countries and some provinces in Canada have refundable credit. So you can take the credit against the payroll tax, essentially. So it might not be perfect, but it is an attempt to try to get at that. One other point I'll just make on the R&D credit, which I don't know where Oregon is on this, but at the federal level, in 2004, I believe, Congress added a new credit called the ASC, the Alternative Simplified Credit. They expanded it in 2006. And more and more companies who take the R&D credit now take what's called the ASC. And not very many states have adjusted their R&D credit language to reflect that. Washington State did just adjust theirs last year, 2 years ago. I just testified on a California hearing, Finance Committee hearing, where they're considering doing that. But as more and more companies shift over to in fact, the House just passed an R&D credit bill that eliminated the regular credit and bumped the ASC. So if the Senate, now who knows what the Senate does, but if the Senate moves in that direction, which I think ultimately it'll go in that direction, ultimately everybody's going to be taking the ASC, and if your credit is designed for the old credit, none of your companies are going to be able to get piggyback off of that. So it may be something you want to explore.
Well, I think that ties it up for today's presentation. I'd like you to thank both our speakers, Rod Atkinson, Senator Devlin.